In this video we're going to look at how to animate props based on motion capture, but the techniques are exactly the same if you're working in keyframe. Let's look at the setup first. So I have my character here characterized, and I added a few markers to use as weapon controls. So I have a right and a left one, so a green and a blue one. So one is parented to the right hand and the other one is parented to the left hand. So that's in case I have like right or left-handed weapons. In this tutorial we'll focus on the right-handed weapon. So here I have a stick that we're going to use as a one-handed weapon. So it's primarily held in the right hand. So that marker here, that's right hand weapon control, is just parented to the right hand FK control of my character control rig, right? So it's part of the control rig. And of course it's part of a character extension. So when I store poses, when I apply poses, when I bake, it's all included in the character. And I have a second controller that's also green. So it's also for that weapon held in the right hand. But this one is parented directly to the reference of my character. In other words, it's parented to the world, so it's in world space. It's hidden by default, and what I've done is in my master relation, which is just a relation in which I set some values on some objects. So it's a relation that drives everything when I animate. So it's like my animation settings that I change on the fly. For my right hand weapon control, I have a spacing option. So I can basically switch between my weapon following the right hand or being in world space. So by default it's in right hand space. So I have my right hand control displayed, and if I switch to world, the display changes. I have the new controller that's now visible. So this is my weapon right world control. So it's the one parented to nothing. It's the one in world space. And so now when I rotate the hand, the weapon doesn't change because this world space control is now driving everything. And basically how it works is when the weapon is in, let's say, right hand mode, the other control, the world space control, follows the other control. So they follow each other, like depending on who's driving. This way they are always on the same spot, right? So here if I move, the other one is on the same spot, okay? And if I change the constraint and I select the world space control and I rotate around, if I go and select the other control that's currently hidden, it's also there on the same spot. And they are both part of the same character extension. So if I move my world space control around and I key in full body or even just in body part, and if I switch seamlessly, because when I keyed, the right hand control understood that it was here, so it captured that current position, and I can switch seamlessly that way. So basically I will be able to bake when I animate, bake in one space, then switch the spacing without losing my animation, and then keep editing my animation in the proper spacing. This is how I'm going to switch between, for example, if you throw the weapon and you want it to be in world space, or just if you want to clean the arcs and then animate the hand around the weapon without changing the weapon arc, and so on. You can see that I also display some hand effectors to reverse the constraints. So I created those auxiliary effectors for both hands, right, by right-clicking and say create auxiliary effector. And when you do that, it creates an extra effector that can drive the hand. So if I create a new one, for example, here, when the IK blind translation and rotation is at the maximum and on the hand it's at 0, that effector will drive the hand, right? And that effector you could parent to anything. So in my case, I have those two auxiliary effectors parented to my world space weapon. And so with another option here, which is right hand IK, I can force the right hand to follow my world space control. So I can basically have the weapon in right hand space following the right hand, or I can have the weapon in world space and have the right hand follow that weapon in IK. And same with the left hand, I can have it follow the weapon as well. So usually on the effectors I change the appearance so that you can select both the original effector and the auxiliary effector. And I will make a tutorial on how to set that up if you want to do your own setup, but basically there's a relation that overrides everything, and in this relation that overrides some custom properties that I added on those controls, and in turn that drives not only the visibility of the controls, but that drives like which parent constraints drives whom. So if I'm in the master relation, when I'm in a right hand space mode, I have a constraint that makes the world space control follow the right hand space control, and this is at 100%. And I have the opposite constraint. I have right hand following the world space control, and this is at 0%. And if I switch the spacing here, that actually switches my constraints around. So now the first constraint is at 0% and the other constraint is at 100%. So you can set it up with a regular parent and child constraints, or you can set it up with multi-referential constraints. But normally, if you're an animator, a tech animator would set that up for you. And it's the same with the IK. When the IK is off, my auxiliary effector always follows the right hand. So if I move the right hand here, and rotate it, my auxiliary effector is on the same spot. Okay, so if I select it here, it's on the same spot. So there's a, like when this option is off, there's a constraint that forces the auxiliary effector to follow my wrists, and this is at 100%. Of course, you just need to make sure as a user, as an animator, not to turn on IK when the weapon is in right hand space mode, because you can't have both following each other at the same time. So usually you switch and then you activate the other mode if you need it, but you don't want this setup here where you have the weapon in right hand space mode and the right hand in IK mode. That doesn't work. So let's see how this works on an actual animation. Here I have a sword animation where the actor swings its sword around. I'm not going to focus too much on the editing, like applying the best poses. I'm just going to look at how to clean up the sword, because that's what we're interested in here. So the poses at the beginning and at the end don't look great, but I'm going to look at that part here where he switches the weapon upside down and plants it into the floor. Of course, by default, when you start with mocap and the prop wasn't recorded, you start by just constraining the prop to the main hand. So in our case, it's still the right hand. Okay. So my prop for now is in right hand space, and it follows the hand throughout the entire motion. But again, around this point here, there's a switch. We don't have the video reference here, but we can see that around here there should be like the left hand. The left hand is coming around the sword, and this is probably the phase where we want a switch to happen. So because I need the weapon to follow the left hand for a little while, I'm temporarily going to change the parenting of the world space control and make it a child of the left hand temporarily. Okay, and I'm going to bake again to make sure that if I switch, I still keep the exact same motion and I don't have the weapon flying randomly or any pop. So I'm going to bake that. can now switch, and because I baked, I don't see any difference. But I know that if I start moving my left hand around, now the weapon follows the left hand, because I temporarily parented my wall space control to the left hand. So my wall space control is currently a left hand space control. Okay? So I see it here, and I'm going to animate it to switch it around. So here, after the first swing, when the left hand comes and grabs the weapon, of course, first I would, adjust all the posings. I would make sure that in right hand space mode, my hand comes and grabs the weapon at a right spot. Okay, so let's do that. Let's just clean up that exchange here. Clean up that contact. So before I'm going to keep a 0 key. I would spend a lot more time, like, making the poses look nice normally, but here I just want to focus on the prop itself. So I'm going to bake that one more time. And now, because I baked, I can switch spaces. And when the hand comes into contact, I'm going to add a 0 key, and then I start animating the weapon to rotate it around. And what I can do is, as the weapon comes here into the left hand and moves around, I can start deleting some keys from the base layer, right? So here, for example, I like this position, so I can come into the base layer and delete all the keys for the rest of the animation, because now I know that the left hand is driving everything, like this. And here I can even like readjust a little bit the posing. So at that point, I'm looking more at the motion of the sword itself, and I'm not so much looking at am I keeping a nice positioning in the left hand all around, like, because I can always clean that up at the very end. At the very end you can always make sure that the hands follow the weapon. So the most important is to animate the hands around to have a nice broad animation of the weapon. So I work more at that stage. I work more at like this kind of distance, and I look at the overall thing, and I make sure that the balance between the body and the weapon feels right, that the weapon doesn't like clip through the head or the torso. I'm looking at the range of motion, this kind of thing. So more like macro details than micro details. Maybe here for the planning, it will need to be more like this. So sometimes the pivot of the weapon isn't ideal, because here I animate like around the handle. You can always animate around another object by selecting, for example, here one of the fingers, and then selecting Shift E, or here the option rotate around to rotate around that object. So this way it's easier to rotate around the hand or around the other hand or whatever. And I'm just going to key my handle. Okay, body parts. So now we have a nice switch between the left and the right hand, and the weapon has the correct orientation. Now I need to figure out the last part where he grabs it back into the right hand, okay? Because here at the end it's in the wrong hand. So it's the same principle but reversed. I just need to bake, plot, and as the weapon comes out, the right hand needs to drive everything. So before switching to right hand, I'm going to make sure that during the contact, like I find a nice contact pose. So I want to adjust the hands relative to each other so that the contact happens at a sweet spot. Actually, we're pretty much there. Let's see. Now I can bake, and now I can do the switch without any visual difference. can start deleting keys on that right-hand space control to have it, stop countering the right-hand animation and start following the right-hand animation. Because if I look at the curves, right, just so you understand, if I look at the curves on the world space control, well, it still follows the left hand. So for the world space control, like those keys are kind of constant, right? There's no transform. It keeps following the left hand. And if I switch to right hand space mode and I select the other control, the right hand space control, my cube, and I look at those curves relative to the right hand, the sword is like countering a lot of that animation, and there's a lot going on here, right? The transforms are pretty big. But if I start deleting keys from that point on, because the right hand space control is driving everything, now I have, like, it follows the left hand now. Maybe at that point I can even copy the initial pose so that I end up with the exact same offset that I have from the beginning. So I basically created a space switching animation, right, where the weapon switches from right hand to the left hand, and I kind of retrieve the performance that the actor was doing on stage. And of course, if you want to do a final cleanup, so apply the correct poses. Usually I would have applied the correct idle pose before doing all those space switching tricks once again. But you can always come back and maybe secure a full body key before the hand switching here, and work out the main swings at the beginning. So here I could make sure that the arcs look nice and everything. Okay. And actually at the end, to do the final cleanup, I want to have my world space control back into actual workspace. So I'm going to reparent it to the reference node. So it's in world space. I'm going to bake everything once again. And when I switch to world space, I can clean that up and maybe add some filters to have a cleaner swing. So if I have some jitter, I can always add some Butterworth. Maybe at the end as well, I want quite a lot of Butterworth. And of course, I also want to clean up that part here where it plants into the ground. So to do that, I want to create an extra locator, or maybe that's already set up on your rig, because that might be something you do often. So maybe you want to create a locator that you add, as always, to the character extensions. In my case, I'm going to show it with a multi-referential constraints. So multi-referential is great because it allows you to have different objects driving each other. So I'm going to add that locator to my extension. And I'm going to add the world space control as one of my rigid objects, and the locator as another rigid object. So now, if I activate it, when I take the locator and I drive around, the other object follows, and vice versa. If I take the world space control and drive around, the locator follows. And then on my constraint, if I lock it here and I go to multi-referential settings, I also see it here in my key controls ref. I see who is driving. So either my world space control, that's around the handle, or the null that's at the bottom. Okay, and I could key that reference and animate that reference, which is great. So first I'm going to bake to make sure that the locator has all the keys on the timeline. Otherwise I won't be able to edit any key. So I baked, nothing changed. And what I'm going to do is maybe duplicate the base layer first. And when the weapon plants into the floor, I'm going to animate the reference. So let's say I select the reference here in the navigator to see it in my F-curves, and I select my property on the first frame, so at 0. I'm going to key to make sure that I have it set as world space. Okay, and later on when it plants into the floor, I'm going to animate that value and make it be the null. And key that. Okay, so for now nothing happens, no difference, and until the moment when he removes it, maybe somewhere here, then it's going to be the world space control driving once again. Okay, and now that I have that constraint animating, I can come in and edit the curves of the null when it's planted. And here again in the keys I can always see like when it's switching. Maybe I'm gonna lock that now that I'm happy with it, because I want to make sure I don't key that property by accident. Just want to key the T and R of my null. So first I'm gonna actually edit the translation. Delete a bunch of key and copy my first key here. Make sure there's no like weird interpolation. Now it's all flat. So now I kind of locked down the translation, but the rotation is still the same. So the rotation is a bit bad now. I'm going to use an aim constraint temporarily to have the weapon still kind of follow the hands, because I like the motion of the hands. It's not too much, so that's good. So let's do a quick aim constraint. So I'm going to have my null looking at my right hand. I'm going to snap it. And maybe I'm only going to activate it when it lands. So I'm going to animate the weight. And when it comes out, I'm going to blend it out. So what you want to do is maybe bake that TR translation and disable the aim constraint. Yeah, now I can actually bake the whole body part, and maybe I want to just ignore the multi-referential now and just have make sure the wall control drives everything, or I can also come in and unlock my active reference property and make sure it's always the world space property. So this way I'm like now forgetting about my multi-referential, and I know that I can clean up the curve of the world space control and not mess anything up. So we have a clean motion on the sword itself, and the last part is simply to make sure the hands follow nicely all along the animation. So for that, we stay in world space. I baked everything, and as always, and I'm gonna activate the IK on both hands. Make sure the hand IK effectors don't have any translation and rotation IK blind, so that the auxiliary effectors drive everything. What you don't want is this, having IK blind on both the auxiliary and the actual IK effector. Only want it on the auxiliary effector so that they drive 100%. And what you can do is, as always, duplicate your base layer and override it, and then start deleting some keys. So what I do is I set the weight of that layer at 0%, and when a hand is on the weapon, I delete all the keys. So for example, at the beginning, my right hand is following the weapon, and then around here there's the switch. So around here I want to keep all the keys because there's a very specific motion happening, and I want to keep that. Maybe a layer on top, but I want to keep it. So I'm only going to delete the keys up until here. Maybe I'm going to copy paste that very first key. So if I look at the layer now, during the entire first part of the motion, the hand is it's following the weapon one-on-one throughout the entire motion. As I edit the fingers, I can also like move around the hand a bit, or I can move around a finger with Shift E, so I can rotate it like this, just to make the wrist flex around the weapon and avoid this kind of position where the wrist is too broken, right? So I can always animate that, especially on the extreme poses. So usually I do that as I also clean up the fingers. So you can also use that tool here, stay on floor, which I usually use for cleaning foot contact, but you can also use it to clean up hand contacts like this. So you say when you want it to start. So let's say now I want to, the right hand comes back onto the weapon, and I want it to stay locked onto the weapon for throughout the entire part here where it drops. So up until here maybe, up, and then you put yourself on a certain frame where you want to keep the pose, and you say do it. So it applies that very pose that you had, it applies it at the beginning and end of the range that you set, so it keeps the contact properly. So I'm going to do it again here until here, maybe increase that, stop, to 4. Okay, so my hand is following the weapon, but you can see that now it's pulling the arm a bit too much around that frame here. So what I can do is, of course, I can edit my weapon animation so the weapon tries to reach for the hand a little more. So I could do that on a layer. But at that point I'm happy with the weapon animation, so I just want to adapt the body to the weapon, not vice versa. So I can also use the IK pulley to force the whole body with full body IK to reach the handle by respecting the angle of the forearm that comes from the original layer. So I have the exact same arm pose, and then I can always increase that angle. So you can use a little bit of that, and you can also, of course, adjust the pose and have it have the IK effector be a bit closer to the shoulder by rotating it a bit like that. So by using both techniques, you'll make sure you avoid like overextension. And same at the end, I will say like here I want start and stop and do it. I can do it quickly for the left hand as well. So when the left hand comes and grabs the weapon, I'm gonna set the layer at 0, delete all the keys on that object, so I'm in selection mode. Maybe copy that key here. So I go broad, I delete all the keys when it's on the weapon, and then I'm just gonna look at the main pose and rekey again. So here, like I know I'm close to the pose that I want, so I'm gonna key. I'm gonna go where the pose is very different, and maybe I'm gonna key here again. I'm looking at the left hand here. So here there's a lot of drifting, so I'm not gonna key. Yeah, I'm gonna key maybe once more here and here, because I have a big space without any key. I'm gonna copy that pose, that key that I have here. So maybe I'm gonna clean that up first. Make sure it's well posed. Something like this. So rotate around the thumb right now to pose more quickly. I'm going to copy that around here and add a bit of IK pulling to avoid the overextension. And here, because I kept the keys from the base layer at the end, I still have all the motion at the end where it lets go of the weapon and it just swings around, even though I'm in IK the whole time. So that's basically how you clean up and edit props. It's by having a setup that allows you to change the spacing, switch between right hand, world hand, switch between right hand space, world space, left hand space, having the hands following the weapons with IK auxiliary effectors, and constantly baking, switching the setup, editing the keys, baking again, switching again, and so on and so forth.